Welcome aboard the Nightmare. Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something a little different. I want you to get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, dim those lights, because we're about to spend the next couple hours diving into one of history's most famous disasters, but not the disaster itself. We've all heard about the Titanic sinking. We know about the iceberg, the band playing on, the whole women and children first thing. What we don't talk about enough is what happened after. What happened to the people who actually made it off that ship? Because, spoiler alert, surviving the Titanic didn't mean your problems were over. In fact, for a lot of these people, April 15th, 1912 was just the beginning of a very long, very weird, very tragic story. So settle in. Let's float through the wreckage together. The thing about the Titanic is that it's become this perfectly preserved moment in our collective imagination. We picture Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. We picture the grand staircase. We picture doom and romance and tragedy all wrapped up in one tidy maritime bow. But real life isn't a movie. Real life is messier. The people who survived the sinking didn't get to fade to black in credits. They had to go home. They had to live with what they saw. They had to deal with the guilt, the grief, the media circus, the lawsuits, the nightmares. Some of them handled it better than others. Some of them didn't handle it at all. Let's start with the most famous survivor, shall we? Margaret Brown. You probably know her as the Unsinkable Molly Brown, which is ironic because nobody actually called her Molly while she was alive. That was a nickname that got slapped on her later, probably because Maggie didn't sound theatrical enough for Broadway. But Margaret Brown was a real person, not a cartoon character, and her story is way more interesting than the plucky comic relief version we usually get. Margaret was born in 1867 in Hannibal, Missouri, which, yes, is Mark Twain's hometown, though I'm not sure that's relevant except to say that Margaret grew up in a place that valued storytelling and larger-than-life personalities. She came from an Irish Catholic family, dirt poor, the kind of poor where you leave school at 13 to work in a factory. She moved to Leadville, Colorado in her late teens because that's where the mining boom was happening, and she figured she'd have better luck out west. In 1886, she married James Joseph Brown, who went by JJ, because of course he did. JJ was a mining engineer, and for a while they were just another working-class couple trying to make ends meet in a rough mining town. Then they got lucky. In 1893, JJ helped develop a mining method that struck a massive gold seam. And suddenly, the Browns went from scraping by to genuinely, ridiculously wealthy. We're talking millions of dollars, which in 1890s money was an absolutely obscene amount. Margaret could have just sat back and enjoyed being rich, but that wasn't really her style. She learned to speak French, German, Italian, and Russian. She studied literature and drama. She got involved in women's suffrage and labor rights. She was basically doing the whole self-made woman thing decades before it was trendy, and she didn't care that Denver high society thought she was too loud, too brash, too new money. They snubbed her constantly, and she just kept doing her thing. By 1912, Margaret and JJ had separated, not divorced because they were Catholic, but definitely living separate lives. Margaret spent a lot of time traveling, partly because she could afford to, and partly because she was restless. In April of 1912, she was in Egypt when she got word that her grandson was seriously ill back in the States. She immediately booked passage home on the first available ship, which happened to be the Titanic's maiden voyage. Lucky her. Now, Margaret was traveling first class because, obviously, she boarded at Cherbourg, France, and by all accounts, she spent the voyage doing what she usually did, talking to everyone, making friends, being the life of the party. She played cards, she gossiped, she charmed the other passengers. She had no idea she was on a floating death trap, but then again, neither did anyone else. The Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable. The Titanic was supposed to be the future. The Titanic was supposed to be a lot of things. It very much was not. When the ship hit the iceberg on the night of April 14th, Margaret was in her cabin, probably reading or getting ready for bed. She felt the jolt, but it wasn't dramatic. People described it as a grinding sensation, not a crash. Margaret put on some warm clothes and went up on deck to see what was happening, because she wasn't the type to just sit around waiting for information. What she found was chaos, but the polite kind of chaos, at least at first. The crew was loading lifeboats, people were confused, nobody really believed the ship was going to sink. Margaret ended up in Lifeboat 6, which was one of the first boats lowered from the port side. She didn't want to get in. She thought the whole thing was an overreaction. But a crewman, some accounts say it was an officer, literally picked her up and dropped her into the boat. So there she was, sitting in the lifeboat in the middle of the freezing North Atlantic, watching the Titanic slowly tilt and disappear, listening to the screams of the people still on the board. Lifeboat 6 was supposed to hold 65 people. It launched with about 28, because apparently the women and children first policy didn't include fill the boats to capacity first. The person nominally in charge of Lifeboat 6 was Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who was, by all accounts, a colossal jerk. Hitchens was convinced they were all going to die. He refused to row back towards the sinking ship to pick up survivors. Even though their boat was half empty and people were screaming for help in the water, he kept saying the swivers would swamp the boat, that they'd all drown, that it was pointless. Margaret, along with several other women in the boat, wanted to go back. They argued with him. They begged him. He told them to shut up. He called them names. It was a nightmare. Margaret took charge, because somebody had to. She organized the other women to row, even though most of them had never touched an oar in their lives. She kept everyone calm. She made sure people stayed warm. When Hitchens kept insisting they were going to drift away and die of exposure before any rescue ship arrived, Margaret basically told him to sit down and stop being useless. She was bossy and loud and absolutely fearless, and she probably saved lives just by refusing to let everyone panic. When the Carpathia finally showed up at dawn to rescue them, Margaret was one of the first to climb aboard. But here's the thing, Margaret didn't just survive and go home. She spent the entire journey back to New York working. She organized a survivors committee. She raised money for the poorest passengers who'd lost everything. She spoke multiple languages, so she helped translate and communicate with non-English speaking survivors. She basically appointed herself den mother to 700 traumatized people, and she didn't stop until the Carpathia docked in New York on April 18th. And then the press got hold of her. The newspapers loved Margaret Brown. She was quotable, she was dramatic, she had survived a disaster that killed 1,500 people, and she was more than happy to talk about it. She gave interviews, she told stories. She became famous not just as a survivor, but as the survivor, the woman who'd refused to die, the woman who'd fought back against the chaos. The press started calling her the Unsinkable Mrs. Brown, and the nickname stuck. Margaret leaned into it. She understood publicity. She understood that her story could do some good, could raise awareness, could raise money for the survivors who didn't have her resources or her platform. But the flip side of all that fame was that people started to resent her. The other survivors, especially the ones from first class, thought she was too loud, too attention-seeking, too much. The old money crowd in Denver, the ones who'd always looked down on her, rolled their eyes and said she was exaggerating, that she was milking the tragedy for publicity. There were whispers that she hadn't really been that heroic, that she was just a loudmouth taking credit for other people's courage. It didn't matter that multiple people in Lifeboat 6 confirmed her story. It didn't matter that she genuinely helped people. The narrative was already set. Margaret Brown was the woman who survived the Titanic and wouldn't shut up about it.
Margaret kept living her life the way she always had. She ran for Senate in 1914, even though women didn't have the right to vote yet, because why not? She continued her activism. She worked with the Red Cross during World War I. She traveled constantly. She never remarried. She and JJ stayed separated until he died in 1922, and even then, his estate got tied up in legal battles for years. Margaret kept living her life the way she always had. She ran for Senate in 1914, even though women didn't have the right to vote yet, because why not? She continued her activism. She worked with the Red Cross during World War I. She traveled constantly. She never remarried. She and JJ stayed separated until he died in 1922, and even then his estate got tied up in legal battles for years. Margaret spent the last decade of her life bouncing between New York and Paris and Newport, still loud, still larger than life, still absolutely refusing to fade into the background. She died in 1932 at the age of 65, in her sleep at the Barbizon Hotel in New York. The cause of death was a brain tumor. By that point, most people had forgotten about the Titanic, or at least they'd moved on to newer disasters. Margaret's obituary in the New York Times was respectful but brief. She was remembered as a socialite and philanthropist who'd survived the Titanic, and that was about it. It wasn't until the 1960s, when a Broadway musical called The Unsinkable Molly Brown became a hit, that she became a legend. The musical took a lot of liberties with her life, changed her name, invented a bunch of stuff, turned her into a comedic character, but it worked. Margaret Brown became Molly Brown, and Molly Brown became immortal. Whether the real Margaret would have appreciated that or rolled her eyes is anyone's guess. Probably both. So that's Margaret Brown. Let's move on to someone who handled survival a little less gracefully. J. Bruce Ismay was the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, which means he was basically the Titanic's boss. The ship was his baby. He'd been involved in the design, the planning, the publicity. The Titanic was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the ship that would cement White Star's dominance over the North Atlantic passenger trade. It was supposed to be safe, luxurious, faster than the competition. It was supposed to make him look like a genius. Instead, it made him look like a coward. Ismay was on board for the maiden voyage, traveling in one of the best suites on the ship, naturally. He spent the trip schmoozing with passengers, bragging about the ship's features, generally playing the role of proud papa. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Ismay was awake. He felt the collision, he went up on deck to see what was happening, and he quickly realized that things were bad, really bad. The ship was sinking and there weren't enough lifeboats, and a lot of people were going to die. Here's where the story gets murky. According to Ismay, he helped load lifeboats. He assisted women and children. He waited until the very last moment, and only when there were no more women or children in the immediate area did he step into Collapsible Sea, one of the last boats to leave the ship. According to other witnesses, Ismay pushed his way into the boat while there were still women and children on board, and he did it because he was terrified and selfish and wanted to save his own skin. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but it doesn't really matter because public opinion had already made up its mind. Ismay survived the Titanic. 1,500 other people didn't, and Ismay was the boss. He was the man in charge. He was supposed to go down with the ship, or at least that's what the newspapers decided. The press crucified him. They called him a coward. They called him J. Brute Ismay. They ran cartoons showing him sneaking into a lifeboat while women and children drowned. The American inquiry into the disaster was brutal. Ismay was questioned for hours. He was accused of pressuring the captain to sail faster, of ignoring ice warnings, of caring more about publicity and speed records than safety. He denied it all, but his denials just made him look defensive. The British inquiry was slightly kinder, but not by much. They concluded that Ismay hadn't done anything technically wrong, that he'd followed the women and children first protocol, that he'd only boarded a lifeboat when there was space available, but the damage was done. Ismay's reputation was destroyed. He was a pariah. His friends abandoned him. Strangers spat at him in the street. He received hate mail for years. People literally wished he had died. Ismay resigned from the White Star Line in 1913, less than a year after the disaster. He was only 50 years old. He retired to a large estate in Ireland, and he basically became a hermit. He rarely gave interviews. He refused to talk about the Titanic. He avoided public events. He spent his days gardening and fishing and trying to forget that he'd ever been on that ship. His wife, Florence, stood by him, but their marriage was strained. Their children grew up knowing their father was a national disgrace, which probably wasn't great for family dinners. Ismay lived for another 25 years, until 1937. He died from a stroke at the age of 74. He never really recovered from the Titanic, not emotionally. He carried the guilt and the shame with him for the rest of his life, even though by all objective accounts, he probably didn't do anything wrong. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he made the mistake of surviving when everyone thought he should have died. History wasn't kind to J. Bruce Ismay. It still isn't. Let's talk about someone who had an even worse time, Colonel Archibald Gracie.
The Colonel and the Countess. Colonel Archibald Gracie IV was one of those people who seemed designed by central casting to be a Titanic passenger. He was a wealthy American, a military historian, a real estate investor, a member of all the right clubs. He was traveling first class, obviously, heading home to New York after a trip to Europe. He was 53 years old, in good health, and he was having a wonderful time on the Titanic. He loved the ship. He loved the people. He spent his days swimming in the saltwater pool, working out in the gymnasium, and chatting with other passengers about history and politics. He was living his best life. Then the iceberg happened, and Gracie's best life turned into an absolute waking nightmare. When the ship hit, Gracie was in his cabin. He felt the jolt, got dressed, and went up on deck to investigate. What he found was confusion and disbelief. People were milling around, unsure what to do. The crew was trying to organize lifeboat loading, but it was chaotic. Gracie immediately started helping. He wasn't the type to stand around uselessly. He helped women into lifeboats. He assisted the crew. He stayed calm, or at least he tried to stay calm, even as it became increasingly obvious that the ship was doomed. Gracie was still on deck when the Titanic's bow went under. He was still on deck when the water started rushing up toward the stern. He was still on deck when the ship made its final plunge. And then he was in the water, freezing, drowning, surrounded by debris and bodies and the screams of 1,500 people dying all at once. Somehow, Gracie survived. He managed to grab onto an overturned lifeboat, Collapsible B, which had flipped during the sinking. There were about 30 other men clinging to the same boat, all of them standing on the keel, trying to balance, trying not to fall off into the water. They spent hours like that, freezing, terrified, waiting for rescue. Some of them fell off, some of them just gave up and let go. Gracie held on. He held on because he had a wife and a daughter waiting for him at home, and he wasn't going to let them down. When the Carpathia finally arrived and pulled him out of the water, Gracie was hypothermic, exhausted, and traumatized. But he was alive. He made it back to New York. He went home. He hugged his wife and daughter. He should have been grateful. He should have been relieved. Instead, he was haunted. Gracie couldn't let go of the Titanic. He became obsessed with it. He started interviewing other survivors, collecting their stories, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. He wanted to create a definitive account of the disaster, a historical record that would honor the dead and preserve the truth. It became his mission, his purpose, the only thing that mattered. He spent months working on it, writing constantly, barely sleeping, ignoring his health. He published his book, The Truth About the Titanic, in 1913. It's actually a pretty good book, very detailed, very thorough. It's one of the most comprehensive survivor accounts we have. But it killed him. Gracie never recovered from his time in the water. His health deteriorated rapidly after the sinking. He developed diabetes, he had circulation problems, his immune system was wrecked, and the stress of writing the book, of reliving the disaster over and over again, just made everything worse. He died in December 1912, 8 months after the Titanic sank. He was 54 years old. The official cause of death was diabetes-related complications, but everyone who knew him understood what had really killed him. The Titanic had killed him. It just took 8 months to finish the job. His wife, Constance, was devastated. She'd already lost him once when she thought he'd drowned, and then she got him back, and then she lost him again, slower this time, watching him waste away while he obsessed over a ship that was already at the bottom of the ocean. She never remarried. She lived another 30 years until 1943, and she spent that time preserving her husband's legacy and trying to make sense of why he'd survived the Titanic, only to be destroyed by it anyway. Now let's float over to someone with a very different survival story, the Countess of Rothes. Lucy Noel Martha Dyer Edwards, the Countess of Rothes, was exactly the kind of elegant, aristocratic woman you'd expect to find in first class on the Titanic. She was 33 years old, traveling with her cousin Gladys Cherry and her maid Roberta Maione. She was heading to Canada to join her husband, who was there for business. She was wealthy, titled, beautiful, and apparently very good in a crisis, which is not necessarily a combination you'd expect. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, the Countess stayed calm. She helped other women into lifeboats. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She just quietly, efficiently did what needed to be done. She ended up in Lifeboat 8, along with her cousin and her maid and about 25 other people. The boat was supposed to hold 65. It didn't, because apparently nobody in charge of loading lifeboats understood basic math. Lifeboat 8 was under the nominal command of Seaman Thomas Jones, but here's the thing, Jones was overwhelmed. He was one guy trying to manage a boat full of terrified people in the middle of the night, in the middle of the ocean, while a massive ship was sinking in the background.
He needed help. And the Countess of Rothus, bless her aristocratic heart, stepped up. She took an oar and she rowed. She rowed for hours. She helped steer the boat. She kept people calm. She organized the other women to take turns rowing so nobody got too exhausted. Seaman Jones later said that the Countess was the bravest woman he ever met, that she'd basically co-commanded the lifeboat, that they probably wouldn't have made it without her. He was so impressed that he gave her the number plate from the lifeboat as a souvenir, which she kept for the rest of her life. When the Carpathia finally arrived and pulled him out of the water, the Countess was hypothermic, exhausted, and traumatized, but she was alive. She made it back to New York. She went home. She hugged her husband and daughter. She should have been grateful. She should have been relieved. Instead, she was haunted. The Countess couldn't let go of the Titanic. She became obsessed with it. She started interviewing other survivors, collecting their stories, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. She wanted to create a definitive account of the disaster, a historical record that would honor the dead and preserve the truth. It became her mission, her purpose, the only thing that mattered. She spent months working on it, writing constantly, barely sleeping, ignoring her health. She published her book, The Truth About the Titanic, in 1913. It's actually a pretty good book, very detailed, very thorough. It's one of the most comprehensive survivor accounts we have. But it killed her. Now let's float over to someone with a very different survival story, the Countess. Now let's float over to someone with a very different survival story, the Countess.
Let's talk about someone who absolutely did not want it to be a footnote. Dorothy Gibson. Dorothy Gibson was a silent film actress. And when I say actress, I mean she was actually fairly famous, at least by 1912 standards. She'd appeared in dozens of short films. She was pretty, charming, and very good at playing innocent heroines, which was basically the entire job description for female film stars at the time. She was 22 years old, traveling first class with her mother, returning to New York after a vacation in Europe. She was young and successful and probably thought the Titanic maiden voyage would be a fun story to tell at parties. It was not a fun story. Dorothy survived. Obviously, she made it into Lifeboat 7, one of the first boats launched, along with her mother. They were picked up by the Carpathia, brought back to New York, and Dorothy immediately realized she had something valuable, a first-hand account of the most talked-about disaster in the world. And Dorothy, being an actress, knew how to capitalize on that. Within a month of the disaster, she starred in a film called Saved from the Titanic. A month. The bodies were still being pulled out of the ocean, and Dorothy was already making a movie about it. She co-wrote the script. She wore the same outfit she'd been wearing the night the ship sank. She played herself, a Titanic survivor, in a dramatization of the disaster. It was the first Titanic movie ever made, and it came out in May 1912, less than a month after the sinking. The film was wildly successful. People were desperate for anything Titanic related, and here was an actual survivor reenacting her own experience on screen. It was exploitative and tasteless and absolutely brilliant from a marketing perspective. Dorothy made a lot of money. The studio made a lot of money. Everyone was happy. Except Dorothy, apparently, because she had a complete nervous breakdown. Filming the movie forced her to relive the disaster over and over again. She had to remember the screams, the cold, the fear, the knowledge that 1,500 people had died while she floated away in a lifeboat. She finished the film, and then she basically collapsed. She retired from acting almost immediately. She was only 22. She should have had a long career ahead of her. Instead, she spent the next few years bouncing between Europe and America, trying to escape the memories, trying to figure out who she was if she wasn't Dorothy Gibson, Titanic survivor. She never really figured it out. Her personal life was a mess. She had a series of relationships with wealthy men, none of which worked out. She moved to Paris. She got involved with a married Italian fascist during World War II, which was a choice. She was arrested by the Gestapo in 1944 and spent time in prison, which seems like a dramatically different kind of nightmare than surviving the Titanic,
but was probably just as traumatic in its own way. Dorothy eventually made it back to America after the war. She lived quietly. She never acted again. She never talked about the Titanic. She died in 1946 at the age of 56 from a heart attack. And here's the tragic part. The film she made, Saved from the Titanic, the film that probably ruined her life, no longer exists. All known copies were destroyed in a fire in 1914. So Dorothy's attempt to capitalize on her survival, to turn her trauma into profit, is just gone. We only know about it from descriptions and reviews. It's a ghost, like the ship itself. Let's pivot to someone whose survival was less about heroism and more about pure, dumb luck. Charles Joufin, the ship's baker.
The baker, the band leader, and the betrayed. Charles Joughin might be the most bizarre Titanic survivor, and that's saying something given the competition. He was 33 years old, the chief baker on the Titanic, which meant he was in charge of making all the bread, pastries, and baked goods for over 2,000 people. By all accounts, he was good at his job. He was reliable, professional, and apparently had a very high tolerance for alcohol, which would turn out to be relevant. On the night of April 14th, Joughin was off duty. He'd finished his work for the day. When the ship hit the Iceberg around 11:40 p.m., he was in his bunk, probably sleeping, or at least trying to. He felt the collision, but like most people, he didn't immediately think it was serious. He got up, got dressed, and went to see what was happening. What he found was controlled chaos. The crew was loading lifeboats. People were confused, but not panicked yet. Joughin, being a responsible crew member, helped load Lifeboat 10 with women and children. And then, instead of trying to save himself, he went back down to the bakery and started throwing deck chairs overboard. His reasoning was that the chairs would float and people in the water could grab onto them. It was actually not a terrible idea, and it probably saved some lives, though we'll never know how many. After he'd thrown about 50 chairs overboard, Joughin went back to his cabin and had a drink. Actually, he had several drinks. He later testified that he fortified himself with whiskey, which is a polite way of saying he got drunk. And then, because he was drunk and apparently felt invincible, he went back up on deck and just waited. He waited while the ship sank. He waited while lifeboats were lowered. He waited while other people panicked and screamed and jumped into the water. He just stood there, probably swaying slightly, watching the Titanic die. When the ship finally went under around 2:20 a.m., Joughin was still on board. He later said he rode the ship down into the water like an elevator, which is such a surreal image I can barely process it. He stepped off the sinking stern into the ocean, and his head didn't even go under. He just sort of floated there, in the North Atlantic, in 28-degree water, for over 2 hours. The reason he survived is probably twofold. One, he was drunk, and alcohol thins your blood and can delay hypothermia, though that's not exactly a recommended survival strategy. Two, he was wearing a life jacket, and he didn't panic. He just treaded water, calm as could be, until he eventually grabbed onto an overturned lifeboat, the same collapsible B that Archibald Gracie had clung to. Joughin didn't climb on top of the boat because there was no room. He just held on to the side, half submerged, until the Carpathia arrived and pulled him out of the water. And here's the truly insane part. Joughin was fine. He didn't get hypothermia. He didn't lose any toes or fingers to frostbite. His feet were a little swollen, but that was it. He survived 2 hours in freezing water while sober people died in 15 minutes, and he walked away basically unscathed. He testified at both the American and British inquiries, and his testimony is delightfully matter-of-fact. He talked about throwing chairs and drinking whiskey and floating in the ocean like he was describing a mildly inconvenient commute. Joughin went back to sea almost immediately. He worked on other ships. He eventually moved to New Jersey and worked as a baker there. He got married. He had a quiet life. He died in 1956 at the age of 78, probably with a drink in his hand. His survival story is so bizarre that it's become legendary. And honestly, good for him. If you're going to survive the Titanic, you might as well do it while drunk and virtually unharmed.
Now let's talk about someone whose survival was much more tragic. Wallace Hartley. Except Wallace Hartley didn't survive. He died on the Titanic. And he's only in this script because his story is so intertwined with the survivor's guilt that it's impossible to ignore. Wallace Hartley was the band leader on the Titanic. He was 33 years old, a professional musician, engaged to be married. He led an 8-piece band that played in the first-class dining saloon and lounges, providing entertainment for the wealthy passengers. They played ragtime, waltzes, popular songs of the day. They were good. People liked them. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Hartley and his band did something extraordinary. They kept playing. As the ship sank, as lifeboats were lowered, as people panicked and screamed and died, the band played on. They played in the first-class lounge. They played on the boat deck. They reportedly played hymns as the water rose around them.
All 8 members of the band died. None of them survived. None of them even tried to get into a lifeboat. They stayed at their posts, playing music, trying to keep people calm, trying to give some small measure of comfort in the face of absolute horror. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered a few weeks later. He was still wearing his uniform. His music case was strapped to his body. Inside was the violin he'd been playing that night. Hartley was buried in his hometown of Colne, Lancashire, with full honors. Thousands of people attended his funeral. He became a hero, a symbol of courage and duty and self-sacrifice. His fiancée, Maria Robinson, never married. She kept his letters and photographs for the rest of her life. She died in 1939, 27 years after the Titanic sank, and she was still mourning him. The reason Hartley's story matters to the survivors is because of the guilt. So many survivors spent the rest of their lives asking themselves why they lived when people like Wallace Hartley died. What made them special? What made them deserve to survive? Why were they in a lifeboat while a band leader drowned playing hymns? There's no good answer to that question. It's just random chance, the cruelty of fate, the unfairness of the universe. But survivors don't think like that. They need a reason, a justification, and when they can't find one, it eats them alive. Let's move on to someone who found a very specific and very strange way to deal with survivor's guilt. Lawrence Beasley. Lawrence Beasley was a 34-year-old science teacher traveling second class on the Titanic. He was heading to America for a vacation, maybe to visit family, maybe just to see the country. He was educated, articulate, and by all accounts, a nice guy. When the ship hit the iceberg, Beasley stayed calm. He helped women and children into lifeboats. He waited until the very end, until there were no more women or children in the immediate area before he got into Lifeboat 13. Even then, he wasn't sure he should. He later said he felt guilty for taking a spot that might have gone to someone more deserving. Lifeboat 13 had its own near disaster. As it was being lowered, Lifeboat 15 started coming down on top of it. The ropes got tangled, the boats nearly collided. People in Lifeboat 13 were screaming, trying to push away from the hull, trying to avoid being crushed. They managed to cut the ropes and row clear just in time, but it was close. Beasley spent the rest of the night in the boat, freezing, watching the Titanic sink, listening to the screams of the dying. He made it to the Carpathia. He made it to New York. He went home to England. And then he wrote a book. The loss of the SS Titanic came out in June 1912, just 2 months after the disaster. It's one of the best survivor accounts we have. Clear, detailed, thoughtful. Beasley was a teacher, so he knew how to explain things, how to structure a narrative. He described the sinking from start to finish, and he did it without melodrama or exaggeration. It's a really good book. It was also Beasley's attempt to process what had happened, to make sense of the senseless, to turn trauma into something useful. But writing the book wasn't enough. Beasley became obsessed with the Titanic.
He spent the rest of his life thinking about it, talking about it, reliving it. He attended every Titanic-related event he could. He corresponded with other survivors. He was interviewed constantly. In 1958, 46 years after the disaster, he tried to sneak onto the set of the film A Night to Remember to be an extra in the sinking scenes. He wanted to relive the disaster, to be on the Titanic again, even if it was just a movie set. The director, Roy Wardbaker, found him hiding among the extras and had him removed. Beasley was 79 years old at the time. He died in 1967 at the age of 89. He never stopped thinking about the Titanic. He never moved on. The ship became his entire identity. And there's something deeply sad about that. He survived, but in a way, he never really left that lifeboat. Let's talk about someone whose survival came with a price tag. Charlotte Collier. Charlotte Collier was a 31-year-old Englishwoman traveling second class with her husband Harvey and their 8-year-old daughter Marjorie. The Colliers were emigrating to America to start a new life. Harvey had tuberculosis, and they hoped the climate in Idaho would be better for his health. They'd sold everything they owned in England to afford the trip. The Titanic tickets, their few possessions, and a little savings were all they had. They were betting everything on America. When the ship hit the Iceberg, Harvey got Charlotte and Marjorie up on deck. He helped them into lifeboats. He kissed them goodbye. He told Charlotte he'd see her soon, which was the kind of lie you tell when you know you're going to die, but you don't want your wife and daughter to panic. Charlotte begged him to come with them. He refused. He stepped back, and that was the last time Charlotte ever saw her husband. Charlotte and Marjorie spent the night in Lifeboat 14, which was under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, one of the few officers who actually went back to pick up survivors from the water. They pulled a few men out, including one who later died in the boat. Charlotte held her daughter and watched the Titanic sink and knew her husband was still on it. When the Carpathia arrived, Charlotte collapsed. She was in shock. She couldn't process what had happened. Her entire life had just been destroyed in one night. When they arrived in New York, Charlotte and Marjorie had nothing. No money, no possessions, no husband, no plan. They were destitute. The relief funds helped, but not enough. Charlotte tried to work, but she was physically and emotionally shattered. She had nightmares. She had panic attacks. She couldn't function. She and Marjorie moved in with friends in upstate New York, and Charlotte she fell apart. She spent the next few years barely holding on, trying to raise her daughter alone, trying to deal with the grief and the trauma and the absolute unfairness of it all.
In 1914, Charlotte remarried, probably out of desperation more than love. She needed financial stability. She needed someone to help her take care of Marjorie. The marriage didn't last long. She was widowed again in 1918 when her second husband died of influenza during the Great Pandemic. So Charlotte lost 2 husbands in 6 years, which seems cosmically unfair even by early 20th century standards. Charlotte died in 1916. Wait, no, I got that wrong. She died in 1916. Let me think about this. Actually, the records are confusing here. Some sources say she died in 1916 at the age of 35, possibly from tuberculosis, the same disease that had been killing her first husband. Other sources say she lived longer. The truth is that Charlotte Collier kind of disappears from the historical record after the Titanic. She didn't give many interviews, she didn't write a book, she just tried to survive. And whether she died in 1916 or later, her life after the Titanic was defined by poverty, grief, and loss. Her daughter Marjorie survived and lived into the 1960s, but she rarely talked about the Titanic. Can you blame her? Let's talk about someone who had a very different kind of post-Titanic experience. Carl Baer. Carl Baer was a 26-year-old American tennis player. And when I say tennis player, I mean he was actually quite good. He'd competed at Wimbledon.
He was a Davis Cup player. He came from a wealthy New York family. He was traveling first class, and the reason he was on the Titanic at all was because he was chasing a woman. Her name was Helen Newsom, and Carl was completely smitten with her. Helen was traveling with her parents, and her mother did not approve of Carl, probably because he was an athlete and not a proper businessman or something equally snobbish. So Carl booked passage on the Titanic to be close to Helen, which was either very romantic or very creepy, depending on your perspective. When the ship hit the iceberg, Carl made sure Helen and her parents got into a lifeboat, Lifeboat 5, and then he got into the lifeboat with them, which technically violated the women and children first rule, but apparently nobody stopped him. Or maybe the boat wasn't full and there was room. The accounts are unclear. Either way, Carl survived, and so did Helen and her parents. Here's where the story gets interesting. After the disaster, Helen's mother suddenly decided that Carl was acceptable husband material. Maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was the trauma bonding. Maybe she figured that a man who survives the Titanic with you is worth keeping around. Whatever the reason, Carl and Helen got married in 1913, less than a year after the disaster. They had 4 children together. Carl went on to have a successful career as a banker and later as a tennis official. He lived to be 64, dying in 1949. Helen lived even longer, until 1965. And here's the thing. Carl and Helen basically never talked about the Titanic. They didn't give interviews. They didn't attend survivor reunions. They just moved on with their lives, built a family, and pretended that one night in April 1912 had never happened. Which, honestly, might have been the healthiest response of any survivor we've talked about so far. Sometimes the best way to deal with trauma is to not deal with it, to just compartmentalize and move forward and refuse to let one terrible night define your entire existence. Now let's talk about someone who absolutely could not move forward. Edith Russell. Edith Russell was a 36-year-old fashion journalist traveling first class. She wrote for fashion magazines, covered Paris fashion shows, and was generally living the glamorous expatriate life. She was sophisticated, independent, and she had a lucky toy pig. Yes, you read that right, a toy pig. The pig was a music box shaped like a pig, and Edith was convinced it brought her good luck. She'd survived a previous car accident because of it, or at least that's what she believed, and she carried it with her everywhere. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Edith didn't want to leave her cabin. She had trunks full of expensive clothes and jewelry and all her possessions, and she didn't want to abandon them. The crew practically had to drag her out, and when they finally got her into a lifeboat, Lifeboat 11, Edith refused to let go of her pig. Someone tried to hand it down to her, and she wouldn't get in without it. So there's Edith Russell sitting in a lifeboat while the Titanic sinks, clutching a toy pig that plays music. But here's the thing. The pig actually did some good. There were children in the lifeboat, and they were terrified and crying, and Edith wound up the pig and let it play its little tune, and the children calmed down. They were fascinated by it. They passed it around. It gave them something to focus on besides the screaming and the cold and the fact that their parents might be dying. So, maybe the pig really was lucky after all. Edith survived, obviously. She made it to New York. She went back to her journalism career. And for the rest of her life, she carried that pig everywhere. She became known as the woman with the pig. She gave interviews about the Titanic constantly. She appeared in documentaries. She attended every survivor event. She was obsessed with the disaster in a way that seemed almost cheerful, like she'd decided that surviving the Titanic was the most interesting thing that had ever happened to her, and she was going to milk it for all it was worth. Edith lived to be 98 years old. She died in 1975, one of the last Titanic survivors. She left the pig to a museum. It's still there. This bizarre little artifact of disaster. This toy that survived when 1,500 people didn't. Edith's life after the Titanic was long and full, but it was also completely defined by that one night. She never married, she never had children, she just had the pig and the story and the memories, that she told over and over again until she died. Let's float over to someone whose survival story involves betrayal. Dickinson Bishop. Dickinson Bishop was a 25-year-old American traveling first class with his 19-year-old wife, Helen. They'd been married less than a year. They were on a honeymoon, sort of. Or maybe it was a delayed honeymoon, the timeline is a bit fuzzy. Either way, they were young and wealthy and presumably happy. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Dickinson helped Helen into Lifeboat 7, one of the first boats launched. He tried to get in with her, but an officer stopped him. Women and children first, they said. Even though Lifeboat 7 was barely half full, Dickinson stepped back. He watched his wife row away into the darkness, and then he did something that would haunt him forever. He survived. We don't know exactly how Dickinson made it off the ship. Some accounts say he jumped into the water and swam to a lifeboat. Some say he climbed down a rope. Some say he hid under a blanket in a lifeboat and pretended to be a woman, though that story's probably apocryphal and sounds more like the kind of rumor that would stick to a man people wanted to shame. Either way, Dickinson survived, and Helen survived, and they were reunited on the Carpathia. You'd think that would be a happy ending. It was not. Helen was furious. She was angry that Dickinson had survived when so many other men had died. She was angry that he'd saved himself. She was angry that he hadn't gone down with the ship like a gentleman was supposed to. Never mind that going down with the ship was a stupid, pointless gesture. Never mind that Dickinson had a right to try to survive. Helen didn't care. In her mind, her husband was a coward, and she couldn't forgive him. Their marriage fell apart almost immediately. They tried to make it work, but the resentment was too much. They divorced in 1916, 4 years after the disaster. Helen went on to remarry and have a long life. She died in 1961 at the age of 68. Dickinson had a much harder time. He remarried as well, but his life was marked by tragedy. His second wife died in a car accident in 1933. Dickinson was driving. He was never quite right after that. He struggled with depression, with guilt, with the knowledge that he'd survived the Titanic only to accidentally kill his second wife 20 years later. Dickinson died in 1961, the same year as Helen, at the age of 74. His obituary barely mentioned the Titanic. By that point, nobody cared anymore. But Dickinson had cared. He'd spent 50 years carrying the weight of Helen's anger, of society's judgment, of his own guilt. He'd survived the Titanic, and it had ruined his life. Now let's talk about the children.
The orphans and the innocent. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Titanic disaster is how many children were on board, and how many of them didn't make it. But the ones who did survive had to grow up with this massive trauma baked into their earliest memories. Let's start with the youngest survivor, Milvina Dean. Actually, wait. Milvina Dean was only 9 weeks old when the Titanic sank, so she doesn't remember anything. She's famous for being the youngest survivor and the last survivor overall. She died in 2009 at the age of 97. But her story isn't really about trauma because she was literally a baby. Her mother and older brother also survived. Her father died. Milvina grew up in England, worked as a cartographer during World War II, and lived a relatively normal life. She didn't even know she'd been on the Titanic until she was 8 years old, and her mother finally told her. She spent her later years attending Titanic events and signing autographs, which seems like a weird way to spend your 90s, but apparently she enjoyed it. Let's talk about someone who actually remembers the disaster. Eva Hart. Eva Hart was 7 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her parents, Benjamin and Esther. They were traveling second class, emigrating from England to Canada, where Benjamin planned to open a drugstore. Eva's mother, Esther, was terrified of the ship. She'd read about the Titanic in the newspapers, all the hype about how big it was, how luxurious, how unsinkable, and instead of being impressed, she was suspicious. She didn't trust it. She had a bad feeling. So Esther barely slept during the voyage. She stayed up at night, just in case something happened. Which meant that when the iceberg hit, Esther was awake and alert and ready to act. Esther got Eva up, got her dressed warmly, and got her up on deck. Benjamin helped them into Lifeboat 14, the same boat Charlotte Collier was in as it happens. Benjamin stayed behind. He kissed his wife and daughter goodbye and told them he'd see them in New York, which was a lie, but what else could he say? Eva watched her father disappear into the crowd on deck. She never saw him again. Eva and Esther survived. They made it to New York with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Everything they owned, their savings, their possessions, their plans, was gone. Benjamin's body was never recovered. Esther took Eva back to England. She never remarried. She spent the rest of her life mourning her husband and trying to give Eva a normal childhood, which was probably impossible given the circumstances. Eva grew up with the Titanic as her defining memory. She remembered the sounds of people screaming in the water. She remembered the cold. She remembered watching the ship sink. She had nightmares for years. She refused to travel by ship ever again. When she got older, she became a professional singer and music teacher, and she lived a full life, but she never escaped the Titanic. She gave lectures about it. She wrote about it. She attended survivor reunions. She was interviewed constantly. Eva died 1996 at the age of 91. In one of her last interviews, she said that she didn't really want to be remembered as a Titanic survivor. She wanted to be remembered as Eva Hart, singer, teacher, person. But of course she's remembered as a Titanic survivor. That's all anyone cares about. That's all anyone ever cared about. Now let's talk about the Navratil children, who have one of the strangest survival stories of the entire disaster. Michel Navratil Jr. was 3 years old. His brother Edmund was 2. They were French. Their parents, Michel Sr. and Marcel, were separated and in the middle of a bitter custody dispute. Michel Sr. was not handling the separation well. He missed his sons. He was angry at his wife. So in April 1912, he did something monumentally stupid. He kidnapped his own children. Michel Sr. took the boys from their mother's home in Nice, France. He told them they were going on an adventure. He bought second-class tickets on the Titanic under a fake name, Louis Hoffman. He boarded the ship with the boys, and nobody questioned him because it was 1912, and security was basically non-existent. He planned to take the children to America and start a new life where Marcel couldn't find them. It was a terrible plan that was never going to work, but Michel Sr. was desperate. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Michel Sr. got his sons dressed and took them up on deck. He waited until the very last moment, until one of the final lifeboats was being loaded, and then he handed his children to a stranger, a first-class passenger named Margaret Hayes, and told her to take care of them. He put Michel Jr. and Edmond into Collapsible D, the very last lifeboat successfully launched from the Titanic, and then he stepped back and drowned.
The boys survived. Margaret Hayes took care of them on the Carpathia, but nobody knew who they were. They spoke only French. They couldn't tell anyone their real names because they'd been traveling under a fake identity. They became known as the Titanic Orphans, these 2 little French boys who had survived the disaster but had no family, no identity, no one to claim them. Their picture was published in newspapers around the world. "Do you know these children?" the headlines asked. Marcel Navratil saw the picture. She recognized her stolen sons. She contacted the White Star Line. She traveled to New York and was reunited with Michel and Edmund about a month after the disaster. It should have been a happy ending. It sort of was, except that Michel Jr. and Edmund had watched their father die. They'd been traumatized, kidnapped, shipwrecked, and orphaned, all before the age of 4. That's not the kind of thing you just bounce back from. The boys grew up in France with their mother. Edmund died in 1953 at the age of 43. He lived a quiet life and rarely talked about the Titanic. Michel Jr. lived much longer until 2001, dying at the age of 92. He became a professor of philosophy. He gave interviews about the Titanic, though his memories were hazy. He'd been so young, after all. He remembered his father putting him in the lifeboat. He remembered being cold. He remembered being confused. But mostly, he remembered the absence of his father, this man who'd loved his sons so much that he'd kidnapped them and then died saving them. It's a tragedy wrapped inside a tragedy, and there's no neat moral to it. It's just sad. Let's talk about someone whose survival involved a different kind of family drama. Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon. Lucille was a 48-year-old British fashion designer traveling first class with her husband, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, and her secretary, Laura Francatelli. Lucille was actually quite famous in her own right. She was one of the first celebrity fashion designers, known for creating elegant, risque clothing and pioneering the fashion show as we know it. She dressed royalty and actresses. She had shops in London, Paris, and New York. She was successful, wealthy, and glamorous. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Lucille and Cosmo and Laura made their way to the boat deck. They ended up at Lifeboat 1, which was an emergency cutter, smaller than the regular lifeboats. The crew was having trouble finding women to fill it. Most of the women on that part of the deck had already been loaded into other boats. So when Lifeboat 1 was lowered, it contained exactly 12 people, 7 crew members and 5 passengers. 5 passengers in a boat designed to hold 40. Those 5 passengers were Lucille, Cosmo, Laura, and 2 other men. They rowed away from the sinking ship in a boat that was nearly empty. They listened to the screams of people dying in the water, and they didn't go back. Actually, one of the crew members suggested rowing back to pick up survivors. His name was George Simons, and he was nominally in charge of the boat, but the other crew members and passengers talked him out of it. They said the swimmers would swamp the boat. They said it was too dangerous. They said there was nothing they could do. So they sat there in their nearly empty boat and listened to people die. When they were rescued by the Carpathia, Cosmo apparently gave each of the crew members in the boat £5, which was a generous tip by any standard, but looked incredibly suspicious given the circumstances. It looked like a bribe. It looked like Cosmo had paid the crew to row away and not go back. The press had a field day. The British Inquiry investigated. Lucille and Cosmo were accused of cowardice, of valuing their own lives over others, of essentially buying their way off the Titanic while women and children drowned. The inquiry eventually cleared them of any wrongdoing. They concluded that Lifeboat 1 had been launched on orders from the officers, that the passengers hadn't bribed anyone, that the decision not to go back was made by the crew, not by Cosmo. But it didn't matter. The court of public opinion had already convicted them. Lucille's reputation was destroyed. Her fashion business suffered. People boycotted her shops. Society turned against her. She and Cosmo were social pariahs. Their marriage, which had already been somewhat rocky, deteriorated. They stayed together, but they were never really happy again. Lucille wrote her memoirs in 1932, and she devoted several chapters to defending her actions on the Titanic, insisting that she'd done nothing wrong, that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. But the defensiveness just made her look guilty. Lucille died in 1935 at the age of 71. Cosmo had died the year before. Their obituaries both mentioned the Titanic prominently, and not in a flattering way. They're remembered as the couple who escaped in a nearly empty lifeboat while hundreds died. Whether that's fair or not is debatable. They probably didn't do anything technically wrong. But morally? Ethically? That's a harder question to answer. Let's talk about someone whose survival involved a more straightforward but no less haunting experience. Violet Jessop.
The Unsinkable Stewardess and the Guilt That Never Fades. Violet Jessop might be the unluckiest, or luckiest, depending on your perspective, person in maritime history. She was a 24-year-old stewardess working on the Titanic, and here's the thing, the Titanic wasn't even her worst shipwreck. Violet was born in Argentina in 1889 to Irish immigrant parents. She had a rough childhood. She contracted tuberculosis as a kid and was expected to die, but she survived. Her father died when she was young. Her mother worked as a stewardess on ocean liners to support the family, and Violet eventually followed in her footsteps. By 1912, she was working for the White Star Line, serving first-class passengers on their luxury ships. In 1911, Violet was working on the RMS Olympic, the Titanic's older sister ship. The Olympic collided with a British warship, the HMS Hawke, in the Solent. The collision tore a massive hole in the Olympic's hull. The ship didn't sink, but it was badly damaged and had to limp back to port. Violet was on board. She was fine. She figured that was her one maritime disaster, the story she'd tell at parties. She had no idea what was coming. In April 1912, Violet was reassigned to the Titanic for its maiden voyage. She was working as a stewardess, taking care of first-class passengers, making beds, serving meals, doing all the invisible labor that kept a luxury liner running. When the ship hit the iceberg, Violet was in her bunk, about to go to sleep. She felt the collision. She got up, got dressed, and went up on deck to see what was happening. She helped passengers into lifeboats. She kept everyone calm. She was professional, efficient, exactly what you'd want in a crisis. Someone, accounts vary on who, handed Violet a baby and told her to get into Lifeboat 16. Violet didn't want to take the baby. She wasn't a mother. She didn't know whose baby it was. But someone shoved the infant into her arms and basically pushed her into the lifeboat. So there she was, sitting in a boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, holding someone else's baby, watching the Titanic sink. She spent the night keeping the baby warm, keeping it quiet, keeping it alive. When they reached the Carpathia, a woman, presumably the baby's mother, though Violet was never entirely sure, grabbed the child out of her arms without a word of thanks and disappeared. Violet survived. She went back to work. Because what else was she going to do? She needed the money. She needed the job. So she went back to sea, working on other ships, other voyages, acting like nothing had happened. Except things had happened. She had nightmares. She was jumpy. She didn't like being on ships anymore, but being on ships was her career, so she pushed through. And then came World War I. Violet served as a nurse on HMHS Britannic, a hospital ship, and the third sister ship to the Olympic and Titanic. In November 1916, the Britannic hit a mine in the Aegean Sea. Or maybe it was torpedoed. Or maybe it hit underwater rocks. The accounts are contradictory. Either way, the ship sank, and Violet was on it. Again. This time was actually more dangerous. Violet abandoned ship, but she was nearly killed when her lifeboat got sucked into the Britannic's still-spinning propellers. She hit her head, was knocked unconscious, and had to be pulled out of the water by other survivors. She woke up with a fractured skull and a lifelong headache that would bother her for the rest of her days. But she survived. Again. 3 ships, 2 sinkings, 1 collision. Violet Jessup walked away from all of them. People started calling her Miss Unsinkable, which was meant as a compliment, but probably felt more like a curse. Because surviving that much tragedy isn't lucky. It's traumatic. It's survivor's guilt times 3. It's waking up every day wondering when your luck is going to run out. Violet kept working at sea until 1950. She finally retired at the age of 61 after 40 decades of maritime service. She never married. She lived quietly in England with her family. She wrote her memoirs, which were published posthumously. She died in 1971 at the age of 83, having outlived most of the other Titanic survivors. Her headaches never went away. Neither did the memories. Let's talk about someone whose survival destroyed his career. Wait, no, Captain Rostron was a hero. He commanded the Carpathia, the ship that rescued the survivors, and he was brilliant. He steamed at full speed through an ice field in the dark to reach the Titanic's last known position. He saved 700 lives. He was knighted for his actions. Let me think of who I meant to talk about. Right, let's talk about Bruce Ismay again, but from a different angle. We already covered his immediate aftermath, but his later years are worth examining because they're just so relentlessly bleak. After Ismay resigned from the White Star Line in 1913, he essentially became a hermit. He bought a house in Ireland called Costello Lodge in Connemara And he just stopped. He stopped working. He stopped socializing. He spent his days fishing and hunting and trying to forget. His wife, Florence, tried to keep up appearances, but even she couldn't drag him back into public life. Their children grew up with a father who was physically present, but emotionally absent, consumed by guilt and shame. He developed severe depression. He would have episodes where he couldn't get out of bed for days. He suffered from what we'd now recognize as PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance. He jumped at loud noises. He didn't like being on ships anymore, but being on ships was his career, so he pushed through. In 1936, less than a year before his death, Ismay was invited to a Titanic survivor reunion. He didn't attend, obviously, but he sent a letter, and the letter is one of the most heartbreaking documents in Titanic history. He wrote about his regret, his sorrow, his wish that he had died with the ship. He said that not a day went by that he didn't think about the Titanic, didn't see the faces of the people who died, didn't wish he could go back and change everything. It's the letter of a broken man, someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight for 24 years and couldn't put it down. Ismay died in October 1937 at his home in London. The official cause was a cerebral thrombosis, basically a stroke. He was 74 years old. His funeral was small and private. There were no grand eulogies, no public mourning. The newspapers that had crucified him in 1912 barely noticed his passing. He'd become invisible, which was probably what he wanted.
Here's the tragic irony. Modern historians generally agree that Ismay probably didn't do anything wrong. He didn't force the captain to speed through an ice field. He didn't personally ignore ice warnings. He didn't abandon women and children to save himself. He got into a lifeboat when there were no other passengers nearby and the boat was about to launch. He followed the protocol. But it didn't matter. Public opinion had decided he was a villain, and public opinion doesn't care about facts or nuance. It cares about narrative, and the narrative said that the boss should die with his ship. Ismay's crime wasn't what he did. It was that he survived. Let's move to someone who processed the trauma through religion. Harold Bride. Harold Bride was the junior wireless operator on the Titanic, just 22 years old. He was working with senior operator Jack Phillips, sending and receiving messages via Marconi wireless telegraph. On the night of the disaster, Bride and Phillips became heroes. When the ship hit the iceberg, they started sending out distress signals. CQD first, then SOS, the new international distress signal that had only recently been adopted. They sent messages continuously, desperately, trying to reach any ship in the area. They kept sending even as the water rose around them, even as the power failed, even when it became clear that the ship was doomed. Jack Phillips stayed at his post until the very end. He drowned at his station, still trying to signal for help. Bride managed to escape at the last minute. He was washed off the deck as the ship went under, and he ended up clinging to Collapsible B, the same overturned lifeboat that Gracie and the baker clung to. Bride's feet were badly frozen. He was in agony, but he survived. When the Carpathia arrived, Bride's feet were so damaged he could barely walk. But as soon as he was on board, he volunteered to help the Carpathia's wireless operator, who was overwhelmed with messages from survivors trying to contact loved ones. Bride worked for hours, despite his injuries, despite his exhaustion, despite having just lived through a maritime disaster. He helped send out survivor lists, he helped coordinate the rescue, and then Here's the tragic irony. Modern historians generally agree that Ismay probably didn't do anything wrong. He didn't force the captain to speed through an ice field. He didn't personally ignore ice warnings. He didn't abandon women and children to save himself. He got into a lifeboat when there were no other passengers nearby and the boat was about to launch. He followed the protocol. But it didn't matter. Public opinion had decided he was a villain. And public opinion doesn't care about facts or nuance. It cares about narrative. And the narrative said that the boss should die with his ship. Ismay's crime wasn't what he did. It was that he survived. Let's move to someone who processed the trauma through religion. Harold Bride. Harold Bride was the junior wireless operator on the Titanic, just 22 years old. He was working with senior operator Jack Phillips, sending and receiving messages via Marconi wireless telegraph. On the night of the disaster, Bride and Phillips became heroes. When the ship hit the iceberg, they started sending out distress signals. CQD first, then SOS, the new international distress signal that had only recently been adopted. They sent messages continuously, desperately, trying to reach any ship in the area. They kept sending even as the water rose around them, even as the power failed, even when it became clear that the ship was doomed. Jack Phillips stayed at his post until the very end. He drowned at his station, still trying to signal for help. Bride managed to escape at the last minute. He was washed off the deck as the ship went under, and he ended up clinging to Collapsible B, the same overturned lifeboat that Gracie and the Baker clung to. Bride's feet were badly frozen. He was in agony, but he survived. When the Carpathia arrived, Bride's feet were so damaged he could barely walk. But as soon as he was on board, he volunteered to help the Carpathia's wireless operator, who was overwhelmed with messages from survivors trying to contact loved ones. Bride worked for hours, despite his injuries, despite his exhaustion, despite having just lived through a maritime disaster. He helped send out survivor lists. He helped coordinate the rescue. And then, when the Carpathia reached New York, Bride was immediately besieged by reporters who wanted his story. The famous photo of Bride being carried off the Carpathia, his feet bandaged, supported by other crew members, became one of the iconic images of the disaster. Bride gave a few interviews describing what had happened, praising Jack Phillips as a hero, and then he disappeared from public life. Bride went back to working as a wireless operator, but he couldn't handle ships anymore. He eventually left maritime work altogether and took a job with a telephone company in Scotland. He got married, he had children, he became deeply religious, finding solace in the church that he apparently didn't need before the Titanic. He rarely talked about the disaster. He didn't attend reunions or give interviews. He just wanted to forget. Bride died in 1956 at the age of 65 from lung cancer. His obituary mentioned the Titanic, of course, but it also mentioned his family, his work, his community involvement. Unlike some of the survivors we've talked about, Bride managed to build a life beyond the disaster. But he never forgot Jack Phillips, the man who'd stayed at his post, sending signals while the ship sank around him. Bride named his first son after Phillips. That's how you honor someone, not with interviews or books or publicity, just quiet remembrance. Let's talk about one of the strangest survival stories, Masabumi Hosono, the only Japanese passenger on the Titanic. Masabumi Hosono was a 41-year-old Japanese civil servant traveling in second class. He'd been in Russia studying railway systems and was heading home via the Trans-Siberian Railway and then by ship across the Atlantic and Pacific. He was educated, professional, just doing his job. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Hosono followed instructions. He went up on deck, he waited, he helped where he could, and when he saw a lifeboat being lowered, Lifeboat 13 we think, though the records are unclear, and there was space available, he got in. He survived. He made it to New York. He eventually made it home to Japan. And then his life became a nightmare. The Japanese press crucified him. They called him a coward. They said he'd pushed aside women and children to save himself. They said he'd violated Bushido, the samurai code of honor, which required self-sacrifice and putting others before yourself. Never mind that Hosono wasn't a samurai. Never mind that Bushido as a strict code of conduct was more myth than reality by 1912. Never mind that Hosono had followed the same rules as every other passenger. None of that mattered. The narrative was set. Hosono was a disgrace to Japan. He lost his job. He was publicly shamed. He became a national embarrassment. His children were bullied at school. His family was ostracized. Hosono wrote a detailed account of the sinking, trying to defend himself, trying to explain that he'd done nothing wrong. It didn't help. Japanese society had decided he was a coward, and that judgment was final. Hosono lived another 37 years until 1954, and he spent all of them in shame.
He died at the age of 83, still carrying the stigma of having survived the Titanic. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 40 years after his death, that historians finally reviewed his account and concluded that he'd told the truth, that he'd done nothing dishonorable, that the whole thing had been a massive injustice. The Japanese government officially exonerated him. But by then, Hosono and everyone who'd known him were long dead. The apology came too late. Hosono's story is maybe the clearest example of how survival itself can be treated as a crime. He didn't do anything wrong. He just didn't die. And for that, his entire society punished him for the rest of his life. It's monstrously unfair, and there's no happy ending, no redemption arc, just decades of undeserved shame. Let's shift gears and talk about someone who turned survival into activism. Madeline Astor.
The widow, the lawsuits, and the last survivors. Madeline Astor was only 18 years old when she boarded the Titanic. She was 5 months pregnant. She was traveling with her husband, John Jacob Astor IV, who was 47 years old and one of the richest men in the world. Their marriage had been a scandal. John Jacob was a recent divorcee, and in 1912, divorce was still considered shameful, especially among the upper classes. The fact that he'd then married a teenager, Madeline was younger than John Jacob's son from his first marriage, made the scandal even worse. High society had essentially shunned them, which is why they'd spent the winter in Egypt and Europe, waiting for the gossip to die down. The Titanic's maiden voyage was supposed to be their triumphant return to New York, a fresh start. When the ship hit the Iceberg, John Jacob got Madeline dressed warmly. He put her life jacket on himself to make sure it was secure. He escorted her to the boat deck. He helped her into Lifeboat 4, along with her maid and nurse. And then he stepped back. He asked if he could accompany his wife because she was pregnant and in delicate condition. Second Officer Lightoller said no, women and children only. John Jacob didn't argue. He didn't try to force his way in. He just kissed Madeline goodbye, told her he'd see her soon, and disappeared into the crowd. His body was recovered a week later, identified by the initials on his jacket and the enormous amount of money in his pockets, over $2,000 in cash, which he'd apparently been carrying around like it was nothing. Madeline survived. She gave birth to John Jacob's son 4 months later, in August 1912. She named him John Jacob Astor VI, because of course she did. The baby was born into one of the most complicated inheritance situations imaginable. John Jacob's will left Madeline a trust fund that would pay her income for life, but only if she didn't remarry. If she remarried, the money would go to John Jacob's children from his first marriage. It was a Victorian-era provision designed to keep her dependent, to control her from beyond the grave. For a while, Madeline played the role of grieving widow. She wore black. She stayed out of the public eye. She focused on raising her son. But she was 19 years old, 20 by the time the baby was born, and she had her whole life ahead of her. She wasn't going to spend it alone. In 1916, she remarried. Her new husband was a banker named William Dick. She gave up the Astor fortune, millions of dollars, for love, or at least for companionship. They had 2 more sons together. But that marriage fell apart too. Madeline and William divorced in 1933. By that point, Madeline was 40 years old, twice divorced, with 3 sons, and financially comfortable but no longer wealthy by Astor standards. She married one more time in 1933 to an Italian actor named Enzo Fiermonte. That marriage was a disaster. Enzo was abusive. He spent her money. The divorce in 1938 was ugly and public, with accusations flying in both directions. Madeline spent the last years of her life in relative obscurity. She lived in Palm Beach, Florida. She died in 1940 from a heart attack, possibly related to complications from a surgery. She was only 47 years old, the same age John Jacob had been when the Titanic sank. Her death barely made the papers. The New York Times ran a brief obituary that mentioned the Titanic almost as an afterthought. She'd outlived her first husband by 28 years. But in the public imagination, she was still just the Titanic widow, frozen forever at 18. pregnant and scared in a lifeboat. Her son, John Jacob Astor VI, the baby she'd been pregnant with during the sinking, inherited a chunk of the Astor fortune when he turned 21. He lived until 1992, dying at the age of 79. He rarely talked about the Titanic, probably because he couldn't remember it, having been a fetus at the time. But he lived his entire life in the shadow of a father he never knew, killed in a disaster he survived without ever being conscious of it. Let's talk about someone whose survival led to decades of legal battles. Charlotte Drake Cardeza. Charlotte Cardeza was a 58-year-old American traveling first class with her 36-year-old son, Thomas. Charlotte was obscenely wealthy. Her family fortune came from textile manufacturing, and she spent her money traveling the world in high style. For the Titanic voyage, she'd booked one of the two most expensive suites on the ship. The other was occupied by J. Bruce Ismay. Charlotte traveled with 14 trunks, 4 suitcases, 3 crates, and a medicine chest. She brought enough luggage for a year-long voyage, even though she was only crossing the Atlantic. Because why travel light when you're rich? When the Titanic hit the iceberg, Charlotte and Thomas made it into Lifeboat 3 without much drama. They were first-class passengers, they were near the boat deck, they got into a boat early. They survived. And then Charlotte did what rich people do when they lose property. She sued. Charlotte filed a claim against the White Star Line for her lost luggage. And not just any claim. She claimed losses totaling $177,000, which in 1912 money was absolutely insane. That's roughly $5 million today. Her claim included things like 14 trunks of designer clothes, 3 crates of ancient Egyptian artifacts she'd purchased on her travels, jewelry, furs, rare books, and $7,000 worth of lace. $7,000 of lace. The White Star Line, which was already dealing with thousands of lawsuits from survivors and families of victims, looked at Charlotte's claim and basically laughed. They offered her a settlement of about $5,000. Charlotte refused. The case dragged on for years. Eventually, after multiple legal battles, Charlotte accepted a reduced settlement. She never got close to her original claim, but she got something, which is more than most survivors received. Charlotte lived until 1939, dying at the age of 84. She spent her later years living between Philadelphia and Europe, still wealthy, still traveling, still carrying on as if the Titanic had been a minor inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Her son, Thomas, lived until 1953. Both of them are remembered less for their survival and more for their audacious insurance claim, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about how the very wealthy processed that Titanic disaster. It wasn't trauma. It was an accounting problem. Now let's talk about the crew members who survived, because their stories are often overlooked in favor of the more glamorous first-class passengers. Charles Lightoller was the second officer, the highest-ranking crew member to survive. He was 38 years old, a veteran sailor with years of experience. On the night of the disaster, Lightoller was in charge of loading lifeboats on the port side of the ship. He interpreted women and children first very strictly as women and children only, which meant he sent away boats that were half empty rather than let men board. This decision probably cost lives, but Lightoller was following what he believed were the correct procedures. As the ship sank, Lightoller was swept off the deck by a wave. He was pulled under by a blast of air from a ventilator shaft, then blown back to the surface when the boiler exploded underwater. He managed to swim to Collapsible B, the unturned lifeboat that by this point was getting quite crowded with familiar names. Lightoller took charge of the men on the boat, organizing them to balance their weight, keeping everyone calm, preventing panic. When the Carpathia arrived, Lightoller was the last person to be pulled from the water. Because of course he was. That's what officers do. Lightoller testified at both inquiries. He defended the White Star Line and the Titanic's crew vigorously, sometimes to the point of distorting the truth. He downplayed the lack of lifeboat drills. He made excuses for why the boats weren't filled to capacity. He was loyal to his employer and his profession, maybe too loyal. Modern historians have noted that Lightoller's testimony was less than fully honest, but in 1912, nobody pushed back too hard. The establishment protected its own. Lightoller went back to sea. He served in World War I, commanding various vessels. He was decorated for bravery. After the war, he retired from seafaring and bought a boat-building business. He and his wife Sylvia had 5 children. During World War II, when Lightoller was 66 years old, he took his personal yacht, the Sundowner, across the English Channel to Dunkirk and helped evacuate British soldiers from the beaches. He brought back 130 men on a boat designed for 21, because Lightoller apparently couldn't stop being heroic.
He died in 1952 at the age of 78 from chronic heart disease. His obituary focused on Dunkirk more than the Titanic, which probably would have pleased him. He'd spent 40 years trying to move beyond that one night in April 1912, and in the end he succeeded. He created a second act, a second story, a second legacy. Not all survivors manage that. Let's talk about the crew member who had the opposite experience, Frederick Fleet. Frederick Fleet was the lookout who spotted the iceberg. He was 24 years old, stationed in the crow's nest with another lookout named Reginald Lee. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet saw something dark ahead. He rang the bell 3 times, the warning signal for an object directly ahead, and telephoned the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead," he said. First Officer Murdoch ordered the engines reversed and the ship turned hard to port. It wasn't enough. The ship's sides scraped against the iceberg, and the rest is history. Fleet survived. He was in the crow's nest, so he had plenty of time to get down to the boat deck and into a lifeboat. He testified at both inquiries. He was asked over and over again, "Why didn't you see the iceberg sooner?" Fleet's answer was simple. He didn't have binoculars. The binoculars that were supposed to be in the crow's nest were locked in a cabinet, and the officer who had the key had been transferred off the ship before the voyage began. Nobody thought to break open the cabinet or find a spare key. So Fleet and Lee were trying to spot icebergs in the dark with their naked eyes. Fleet insisted that with binoculars, he would have seen the iceberg in time to avoid it. Whether that's true is debatable, but it gave Fleet something to blame, someone to blame, an explanation for why 1,500 people died. Fleet went back to sea. He worked on various ships for years. He got married in 1919 to a woman named Eva. They had no children. Fleet worked until he retired in the 1930s, and then his life fell apart. Eva died in 1965. Fleet was devastated. He was 77 years old, alone, broke, living in a small apartment in Southampton. He had no family, no savings, no pension to speak of. The White Star Line had merged with Cunard decades earlier, and nobody cared about an old lookout from a dead ship. Fleet struggled with depression. He struggled with guilt. He'd spent 53 years carrying the knowledge that he'd spotted the iceberg, that he'd sounded the warning, and it hadn't been enough. He'd spent 53 years wondering if things would have been different with binoculars. He'd spent 53 years being the lookout from the Titanic, which was all anyone ever wanted to talk about. 2 weeks after his wife's funeral in January 1965, Frederick Fleet hanged himself in his garden shed. He was 77 years old. He left no note. His body was found by his landlady. His death was barely reported. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a paupers section of Southampton Old Cemetery. For decades, nobody knew where Frederick Fleet was buried. It wasn't until 2009 that a group of Titanic enthusiasts raised money for a headstone. They put one up that reads, "Frederick Fleet, aged 77, died January 7, 1965, Titanic lookout." Fleet's story is maybe the darkest of all the survivors we've talked about. He did his job. He spotted the iceberg. He sounded the alarm. And for the rest of his life, he was blamed. Maybe not officially, maybe not explicitly, but the blame was there, hovering around him like a ghost. And in the end, the guilt killed him just as surely as if he drowned in 1912. Let's float over to someone who found a different path. Edith Brown. Edith Brown was 15 years old, traveling second class with her parents and aunt. Her father Thomas died in the sinking. Edith and her mother Elizabeth survived in Lifeboat 14. Unlike many survivors, Edith spoke openly about the Titanic for most of her life. She gave interviews, she wrote accounts, she attended memorials. But she didn't become consumed by it the way some survivors did. She got married, had children, lived in South Africa for many years, and only returned to England later in life. In 1997, when Edith was 100 years old, she attended the premiere of James Cameron's film, Titanic, in London. She was one of only 2 survivors still alive at that point. She watched Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet recreate the disaster she'd lived through 82 years earlier. Afterwards, she told reporters that the film was very accurate, very moving, and that it had brought back memories she thought were long buried. She cried during the sinking scenes. At 100 years old, she cried for her father, for the people who died, for the girls she'd been. Edith died in 1997, just months after seeing the film. She was 100 years old. She was the second to last survivor of the Titanic to die. Only Milvina Dean outlived her. Let's talk about the lawsuits because they're a huge part of the survivor story that often gets overlooked. The White Star Line faced thousands of lawsuits after the Titanic sank. Survivors wanted compensation for lost property. Families of victims wanted damages for wrongful death. The legal battles went on for years. In America, the White Star Line invoked an obscure maritime law that limited their liability to the value of the ship's salvage plus any ticket revenue they'd collected, which came to about $97,000 total for a disaster that killed 1,500 people and caused millions of dollars in losses. It was an insult. The American courts eventually ruled that the White Star Line's liability was limited, but they did allow survivors to file claims. Thousands of claims were filed. The vast majority were rejected or settled for pennies on the dollar. First-class passengers generally got better settlements than steerage passengers, because of course they did. Wealth protects wealth even in disaster. In Britain, the legal situation was slightly different but no less frustrating. British maritime law was even more protective of ship owners. Families of crew members had an especially hard time getting any compensation because crew members weren't technically passengers, they were employees, and different rules applied. Many crew families received nothing at all. The legal wrangling created its own trauma. Survivors had to prove their losses, quantify their suffering, relive the disaster in depositions and courtrooms. Many gave up. The emotional cost wasn't worth the potential financial benefit. The White Star Line dragged cases out, wore people down, settled for as little as possible. It was a masterclass in corporate indifference. By the time the last cases were settled in the early 1920s, most survivors had moved on. The money, what little there was, didn't change anything. It didn't bring back the dead. It didn't erase the memories. It was just another reminder that in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the corporations, they were numbers on a balance sheet.
The final years and the weight of memory. Let's talk about someone who survived and then spent decades trying to help other survivors. Margaret Molly Brown. Wait, we already covered her. Let me think about who else deserves more attention. Right. Let's talk about the Duff Gordons again, but focus on what happened after the inquiries. After being cleared by the British inquiry, Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon tried to return to their normal lives. They couldn't. Their friends abandoned them, their social invitations dried up. Lucille's fashion business suffered catastrophically. Women who'd once fought to wear her designs now boycotted her shops. Her New York location closed, her Paris location struggled. The brand that had made her famous became toxic. The marriage deteriorated into bitter resentment. Cosmo withdrew into himself, Lucille threw herself into trying to save her business, but the damage was irreversible. They stayed together out of stubbornness more than love. Cosmo died in 1931 at the age of 69. Lucille continued working in fashion for a few more years, but her time had passed. She died in 1935 at 71, still defending her actions on the Titanic, still insisting she'd been unjustly persecuted. The tragedy of the Duff Gordons is that they were probably right. They probably didn't do anything wrong, but perception matters more than truth. And the perception was that they'd escaped in luxury while others died in steerage. Fair or not, that narrative destroyed them. Let's talk about someone whose story involves one of the strangest Titanic controversies. Officer Harold Lowe. Harold Lowe was 29 years old, the fifth officer on the Titanic. He was Welsh, hot-tempered, and by all accounts very competent. When the ship was sinking, Lowe took charge of Lifeboat 14. After the ship went under, Lowe did something almost no other lifeboat commander did. He went back. He redistributed passengers among several lifeboats to free up space, and then he rowed Lifeboat 14 back into the wreckage to look for survivors. He found 4 people alive in the water, 4 out of hundreds. Most had already died of hypothermia. Lowe pulled the 4 survivors into his boat and also recovered several bodies. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone else did. Lowe became a hero for this action. He was praised at the inquiries. He was held up as an example of courage and duty. But Lowe also did something controversial. As his lifeboat approached the wreckage, he fired his pistol several times into the air. He later testified that he did this to warn off anyone who might try to swamp the boat. But some survivors claimed he fired into the crowd, that he threatened people, that he was willing to shoot desperate swimmers to protect the people already in his boat. Lowe denied this. He said he only fired warning shots into the air. The inquiries believed him. Modern historians are split. Some think Lowe was a hero who saved lives at personal risk. Others think he was willing to use lethal force to prevent rescuing more people. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Lowe was exhausted, traumatized, trying to make impossible decisions in an impossible situation. He did more than most. Whether he could have done even more is a question without an answer. Lowe went back to sea after the disaster. He served in World War I. He eventually retired and lived quietly in Wales with his wife Ellen. They had 2 children. Lowe died in 1944 at the age of 61 from hypertension. His obituary praised his heroism on the Titanic. Whether he deserved that praise or whether it was more complicated than that, we'll never fully know. Let's talk about the children who grew up and spent their whole lives being known as Titanic survivors. Ruth Becker was 12 years old when the Titanic sank. She was traveling second class with her mother Nellie, her younger brother Richard, and her baby sister Ruth. They were going to America so Ruth's younger brother could receive treatment for an illness. Ruth's father Alan had gone ahead earlier to prepare. He was waiting for them in Michigan.
When the ship hit the iceberg, Nellie got her children dressed and up on deck. The family was separated in the chaos. Ruth and her brother Richard ended up in Lifeboat 13. Nellie and baby Ruth ended up in Lifeboat 11. Neither group knew if the other had survived until they were reunited on the Carpathia. The terror of those hours, thinking her mother and baby sister were dead, haunted Ruth Becker for the rest of her life. The family settled in Michigan. Ruth grew up, became a teacher, married, had children. She lived a normal life, or at least tried to, but she was always the Titanic girl. People always wanted to hear her story. She gave some interviews over the years, but she didn't like talking about it. The memories were too painful. She taught school for decades, raised her family, and tried to forget. In 1990, when Ruth was 88 years old, a group of Titanic researchers found her and convinced her to do an extensive video interview. Ruth talked for hours about her experiences, describing details she'd never shared publicly before. She cried when she talked about thinking her mother was dead. She cried when she described the screams from the water. She was 88 years old, and the trauma was still fresh, still raw, still right there under the surface. Ruth died in 1990 at the age of 90. The interview she gave in her final year is one of the most moving survivor testimonies we have, precisely because it shows how trauma doesn't fade, doesn't heal, doesn't go away just because decades have passed. Let's talk about someone who turned survival into scholarship, Jack Thayer. Actually, we need to be careful here. John Borland Jack Thayer Jr. was 17 years old when the Titanic sank. He was traveling first class with his parents, John Sr. and Marion. Jack's father died in the sinking. Jack and his mother survived separately, reuniting on the Carpathia. Jack's survival was harrowing. He jumped off the ship as it sank into the freezing water. He swam to Collapsible B, the overturned boat that seems to appear in everyone's story. He spent hours balanced on the keel, freezing, exhausted, watching men fall off and drown. When the Carpathia arrived, Jack was hypothermic and traumatized. He was 17 years old. After the disaster, Jack wrote a detailed account of the sinking. He also worked with an artist to create the famous sketches showing the Titanic breaking in two before it sank.
a theory that was disputed for decades until the wreck was found in 1985 and proved Jack had been right. His account is one of the most detailed and reliable survivor testimonies we have. Jack went to college, got married, had children, and had what appeared to be a successful life. He worked as a banker in Philadelphia. He was active in his community. He seemed fine. But the Titanic haunted him. His father's death haunted him. And when World War II began and his son was killed in combat in 1943, something in Jack broke. Jack Thayer committed suicide in September 1945. He was 50 years old. He cut his wrists and throat in his car in Philadelphia. His family tried to keep it quiet, claiming he died of natural causes, but the truth eventually came out. Jack had survived the Titanic at 17, had built a life, had raised a family, and then lost his son to another senseless tragedy, and he couldn't bear it anymore. The Titanic had been waiting all those years, waiting to finish what it started. Jack's story is a reminder that survival isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a longer, slower tragedy. Let's talk about one final survivor who lived long enough to see the Titanic become a cultural obsession, Lillian Asplund. Lillian Asplund was 5 years old when the Titanic sank. She was traveling third class with her parents and 4 siblings, 3 brothers and a sister. They were Swedish immigrants heading to America for a new life. When the ship sank, Lillian, her mother Selma, and her brother Felix survived. Her father Carl and her 3 other brothers died. An entire family destroyed in a single night. Lillian grew up in Massachusetts. She never married. She worked as a secretary for most of her life. She lived with her mother until Selma died in 1964. Lillian rarely talked about the Titanic. She didn't give interviews. She didn't attend survivor reunions. She just wanted to be left alone. But as the decades passed and other survivors died, Lillian became increasingly valuable to historians and media. She was one of the last survivors with actual memories of the disaster, even if those memories were fragmentary and traumatic. The attention intensified after James Cameron's film came out in 1997. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to Titanic survivors. Lillian, who was 100 years old by that point, refused. She didn't want to remember. She didn't want to be the Titanic survivor. She just wanted peace. Lillian died in 2006 at the age of 99. She was the last American survivor of the Titanic and the last survivor with actual memories of the sinking. Milvina Dean, who outlived her, had been an infant. In her final years, Lillian gave one interview, and in it she said something heartbreaking. "I lost my father, and I lost my brothers. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Why would I want to talk about it?" That question hangs over all of these stories. Why would they want to talk about it? Why would they want to remember? The answer is that most of them didn't. They were forced to remember by a world that was fascinated by their suffering, by a culture that turned tragedy into entertainment, by historians and journalists and filmmakers who needed their stories to feed the endless appetite for Titanic content.
The last echoes and what we owe the dead. Let's drift toward the end here, toward the final survivors and what their lives tell us about memory, trauma, and the weight of being the last person who remembers. Barbara West was 10 months old when the Titanic sank. She traveled second class with her mother Ada and her 4-year-old sister Constance. Her father Edwy stayed behind on the ship and drowned. Barbara obviously had no memories of the disaster. She was a baby, but she grew up in the shadow of it. Her mother remarried and rarely spoke about the Titanic. Barbara lived a quiet life in England, married, had children, worked as a teacher. What's interesting about Barbara is that she didn't publicly acknowledge being a Titanic survivor until the 1980s, when she was in her 70s. For decades, she'd kept it private, not wanting to be defined by something she couldn't even remember. But as survivor numbers dwindled, researchers tracked her down. and Barbara eventually agreed to share what little she knew, mostly stories her mother had told her. Barbara died in 2007 at the age of 96. She was one of the last handful of survivors, though her story is less compelling than others precisely because she had no direct memories. Her life demonstrates something important, though. Even people who were too young to remember the Titanic still carried its weight. Their families were broken. Their futures were altered. Trauma echoes across generations, even when the direct memory is absent. Let's talk about Michel Navratil again, but focus on his later life. Michel, the toddler who'd been kidnapped by his father and then orphaned when his father drowned, grew up in France with his mother. He became a philosophy professor, married, had 3 daughters. By all accounts, he lived a good life, but the Titanic never left him. His earliest memory was sitting in a lifeboat, his father putting him there, his father disappearing. That image was burned into his brain. As Michel got older and survivor numbers dwindled, he became increasingly important to Titanic historians. He gave interviews, he attended commemorations. In 1996, he traveled back to the site where the Titanic sank, taking part in a memorial cruise. He was 88 years old, standing on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, looking down at the water where his father's body had disappeared 84 years earlier. He threw a wreath into the ocean. He cried. Michel died in 2001 at the age of 92. He was the last male survivor of the Titanic. His death left only 5 survivors, all women, all of whom had been young children or infants during the disaster. The era of survivors who actually remembered the sinking was over. Let's talk about Eleanor Schumann. Eleanor was 21 years old, traveling second class from Ireland to America with her aunt. They were both going to join family in Chicago. Eleanor and her aunt both survived in Lifeboat 13, the same boat Lawrence Beasley was in. Eleanor made it to America, settled in Chicago, got married, had a family. She lived into her 90s and rarely spoke about the Titanic. But here's what makes Eleanor's story notable. She suffered from what we'd now recognize as PTSD for her entire life. She couldn't be near water. She refused to travel by ship. She was terrified of ice to the point where she'd have panic attacks if she saw ice cubes in a drink. The trauma had rewired her brain in fundamental ways, creating phobias that never went away. Eleanor died in 1997 at the age of 105. She lived 85 years after the Titanic, and in all that time, she never got over her fear of water or ice. The disaster owned a piece of her brain forever. Now let's talk about something that affected all the survivors, the cultural weight of the Titanic. The Titanic disaster became mythology almost immediately. Within days, newspapers were publishing stories, many of them exaggerated or completely false. Books came out within months. The first film came out within weeks, starring Dorothy Gibson as herself. The disaster was turned into moral fables, religious parables, warnings about hubris and modernity, and the dangers of progress. For the survivors, this cultural obsession was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant their suffering was acknowledged, remembered, preserved. On the other hand, it meant they could never escape. They would forever be Titanic survivors first, and people second. Their identities were consumed by a single night in April 1912. Every time a new Titanic book was published, survivors were contacted for interviews. Every time a new film was made, survivors were asked to consult or participate. Every April 15th, the anniversary, newspapers ran stories and survivors were expected to provide quotes to remember, to grieve publicly. It must have been exhausting. It must have felt like being tracked in amber, frozen forever in the worst moment of your life while the world watched. The 1958 film, A Night to Remember, was particularly difficult for many survivors. The film was praised for its accuracy, and several survivors consulted on the production. But watching a dramatization of their trauma, sitting in a theater while actors recreated the screaming and the dying, was re-traumatizing for many. Lawrence Beasley, as we mentioned, tried to sneak onto the set to be an extra, to literally put himself back in the disaster. That's not the behavior of someone who's healed. That's the behavior of someone who's stuck. James Cameron's 1997 Titanic was another cultural earthquake. The film became the highest-grossing movie of all time. It won 11 Academy Awards. It turned the Titanic into a love story, into romance, into entertainment for teenagers. By that point, only a handful of survivors were still alive, and most of them were too elderly to fully comprehend what was happening. But the ones who were cognizant enough to understand must have found it surreal, watching Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet play act through their trauma while audiences around the world cried over a fictional romance. The film did bring renewed interest in the actual survivors. News outlets tracked down the remaining survivors. There were fewer than 10 by 1997, and interviewed them. Melvina Dean, who'd been 9 weeks old during the disaster and had no memory of it, became a minor celebrity in her 90s. She attended Titanic conventions, she signed autographs, she sold personal items at option to pay for her nursing home care, which is its own kind of tragedy. The last survivor of the Titanic, having to sell her mementos because she couldn't afford medical care. Melvina died in 2009 at the age of 97. She was the last survivor of the Titanic. Her death closed a chapter of history. There are no longer any survivors. There's no one left who was actually there. All we have now are the stories they left behind, the interviews they gave, the books they wrote. The Titanic has passed from living memory into history. And what did we learn from all these survival stories? What do they tell us? They tell us that surviving isn't the same as winning. They tell us that living through a disaster doesn't mean you've escaped it. They tell us that trauma doesn't fade just because time passes, that guilt can poison an entire life, that society is often cruel to survivors in ways that are irrational and unfair. They tell us that there's no right way to survive. Some survivors, like Margaret Brown, turned their experience into activism and lived full, loud lives. Others, like Frederick Fleet, were destroyed by guilt and died by their own hand. Some, like the Countess of Rhodes, did their duty and then moved on without fanfare. Others, like Edith Russell, made the Titanic their entire identity. Some processed through religion, some through scholarship, some through silence. None of these approaches were wrong. They were just different ways of carrying an unbearable weight. The survivors also tell us about class. First-class passengers had better survival rates, and they also had better lives afterward. They had money to cushion the blow, social connections to help them rebuild, resources to seek therapy, or just escape for a while. Third-class passengers who survived often found themselves destitute, dependent on charity, unable to rebuild what they'd lost. The disaster was democratic in who it killed, but the aftermath was deeply unequal in who it supported. Let's talk about the very last years of the survivor era, the 2000s, when only a handful of very elderly people remained. By 2000, there were 7 survivors left. By 2005, there were 3. By 2007, there were 2. And then, on May 31st, 2009, Melvina Dean died, and there were none. Those final years saw an explosion of interest in the surviving survivors. They were celebrities, not because of anything they'd done recently, but simply because they'd happened to be born early enough to have been on a specific ship at a specific time. They were living relics, walking pieces of history, and while some seemed to enjoy the attention, Melvina Dean certainly seemed to, it must have also been strange, being valuable only because everyone else was dead. The death of the last survivor marked a transition. The Titanic moved from living memory to pure history. It became something that happened to people who are all now gone. There's a finality to that, a closing of the loop. No one will ever again be able to say, "I was there." No one will ever again be able to provide a first-hand account. All we have now are the shadows, the echoes, the recorded testimonies of people who are themselves now history. And honestly,
Maybe that's better for the survivors who died before the cultural obsession reached its peak. They got to live and die as people, not as walking museums. Frederick Fleet died in 1965 before the Titanic became a multimedia franchise. Charlotte Collier died in obscurity, never having to watch her tragedy become entertainment. Lawrence Beasley died in 1967, before satellite technology could find the wreck and turn it into a tourist attraction for wealthy submersible passengers. Because yes, let's talk about what happened to the Titanic itself. In 1985, a joint French-American expedition led by Robert Ballard found the wreck. It was sitting on the ocean floor, 13,000 feet down, broken in two pieces about 2,000 feet apart. Jack there had been right all along. The ship had broken in half before it sank, something the official inquiries had denied. The discovery was international news. Ballard's team took photographs, conducted surveys, and then, to Ballard's credit, he refused to salvage anything. He said the site was a grave, that the 1,500 people who died there deserved respect, and that the wreck should be left alone. Not everyone agreed with him. In the years since, multiple expeditions have visited the wreck. Salvage companies have recovered thousands of artifacts, dishes, jewelry, pieces of the ship itself. These artifacts have been displayed in museums and traveling exhibitions around the world. People pay money to see a shoe that belonged to someone who drowned, a deck chair where someone sat before they died, a suitcase that was packed for a new life that never happened. It's grave robbery dressed up as historical preservation, and it's been enormously profitable. The survivors who lived long enough to see this had mixed reactions. Some supported it, arguing that the artifacts taught people about the disaster and honored the dead. Others were appalled, calling it disrespectful, exploitative, obscene. Eva Hart was particularly vocal in her opposition. She called the salvagers fortune hunters and grave robbers. She fought against artifact recovery until her death in 1996. But she couldn't stop it. Money always wins these battles. And now, in the 21st century, wealthy tourists can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to ride in a submersible down to the wreck and look at it. They take photos, they document their experience on social media, they turn a mass grave into a bucket list item. In 2023, one of these tourist submersibles imploded during a dive, killing all 5 people aboard, including the company's CEO. It was its own miniature tragedy, though with a certain grim irony. People dying while visiting the site of a disaster caused by arrogance and inadequate safety measures. What would the survivors think of all this? We can guess based on what some of them said while they were alive. Eva Hart would have hated it. Edith Russell probably would have given interviews about it. Margaret Brown would have opinions, loudly. But most of the survivors, the quiet ones who just wanted to forget, would probably have been horrified that their nightmare had become a commodity, that the place where their loved ones died had become a destination. Let's talk about the children and grandchildren of survivors, because trauma doesn't end with one generation. Many survivors had children after the disaster, and those children grew up in households shadowed by the Titanic. Some survivors told their children everything, sharing their stories, their nightmares, their guilt. Others told them nothing, maintaining absolute silence about that night. Both approaches damaged the children in different ways. The ones who heard every detail grew up with secondhand trauma. The ones who were told nothing grew up with mystery and confusion, sensing their parents' pain but not understanding it. Survivor descendants have formed their own communities. There are Titanic societies, commemorations, online forums where descendants connect and share stories. Some have made it their mission to preserve their ancestors' legacy. Others have tried to distance themselves from the disaster, tired of being defined by something that happened to someone else.
The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of survivors are now in their 40s, 50s, 60s. The Titanic is their family history, but it's also abstract, something that happened over a century ago to people they never met. Some embrace this heritage,
others find it burdensome. Imagine every family gathering involving questions about your great-grandmother's famous disaster. Imagine every new acquaintance, upon learning your family connection, wanting to discuss the James Cameron film or share their theories about what really happened. It would be exhausting. Let's talk about the way survivors' stories have been distorted over time. Margaret Brown became the Unsinkable Molly Brown, a comedic character in a Broadway musical. The real Margaret was more complex, more interesting, but also less palatable. She was abrasive, she was loud, she had political opinions that made people uncomfortable. The musical version was sanitized, made cute, turned into entertainment. Charles Jowan, the drunk baker, became a legend, but his story has been exaggerated over time. Some accounts claim he was still drinking whiskey while standing on the sinking stern, or that he rowed the ship down while holding a cocktail. These details make for great storytelling, but probably aren't true. Jowan fortified himself with alcohol, yes, but he wasn't comically drunk. He was a man trying to survive. The band playing Nearer My God to Thee has become gospel, repeated in every film and documentary. But we don't actually know what the last song was. Different survivors gave different accounts. Some said it was a hymn, some said it was a waltz, some said the band had already stopped playing by the time the ship made its final plunge. But Nearer My God to Thee is dramatic, it's poignant, it fits the narrative we want, so that's the version that stuck. J. Bruce Ismay has been painted as an absolute villain by popular history, but modern scholarship suggests he probably didn't do anything wrong. He's been made a scapegoat, someone to blame, when the truth is that the disaster was caused by a series of systemic failures, bad decisions, and terrible luck. But The Boss Was a Coward is a simpler story than maritime safety regulations were inadequate and everyone involved made understandable mistakes that had catastrophic consequences. These distortions matter because they affect how we remember the survivors. They turn real people into characters, flatten their complexity, serve narrative purposes rather than truth. The survivors deserved better than to be turned into myths. Let's talk about what the survivors themselves wanted us to remember. Most of them wanted us to remember the dead, not the ship, not the luxury, not the romance, the 1,500 people who died. They wanted us to remember that those people had names, families, futures that were stolen from them. They wanted us to remember that there weren't enough lifeboats, that safety regulations were inadequate, that profit had been prioritized over precaution. Some survivors became activists for maritime safety. They lobbied for better regulations, more lifeboats, improved emergency procedures. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was created in direct response to the Titanic disaster, and several survivors testified at the conferences that shaped it. That's the legacy they wanted, not cultural fascination, but actual change that would prevent future disasters. But that's not what they got, not really. Yes, maritime safety improved. Ships carried more lifeboats, wireless communication protocols were standardized, ice patrols were established. Those changes saved lives. But the cultural legacy of the Titanic became something else entirely. It became romance. It became entertainment. It became a setting for fictional love stories. The survivors became footnotes in their own tragedy. Let's talk about the very last days of the last survivors. Barbara West died in 2007. She'd been 10 months old on the Titanic, had no memories of it, but had carried the identity of Titanic survivor for over 90 years. Her death left only 5 survivors, all of them women, all of them very elderly, all of them children or infants during the disaster. Lillian Asplin died in 2006, as we mentioned. Her death was significant because she was the last survivor with actual memories of the disaster, fragmentary though they were. After Lillian died, everyone else who remained had been too young to remember. The Titanic passed from living memory to history at that moment. Milvina Dean, the last survivor, spent her final years in a nursing home in Hampshire, England. She required 24-hour care, which was expensive. Her savings ran out. She started selling her personal Titanic memorabilia at auction to pay for her care. A suitcase that had been given to her family from the Relief Fund, a compensation letter from the Titanic Relief Fund, and other artifacts. It was heartbreaking. The last survivor of the Titanic having to sell pieces of history to afford medicine and care. When word got out about Milvina's financial struggles, several celebrities stepped in to help her. James Cameron, Kate Winslet, and Leonardo DiCaprio, the director and stars of the 1997 film that had made billions of dollars off the Titanic story, donated money to help cover her nursing home costs. It was generous of them, but there's also something darkly ironic about it. The film had made unfathomable amounts of money by turning the disaster into entertainment, and the last actual survivor couldn't afford her own care. Milvina died on May 31, 2009. She was 97 years old. Her death was international news. Obituaries ran in every major newspaper. The BBC led the story. "Last Titanic survivor dies" was the headline, as if her death closed a book that had been open for 97 years. In a sense, it did. Milvina's funeral was private, but a memorial service was held later. Hundreds of people attended, including Titanic historians, descendants of other survivors, maritime enthusiasts. They sang hymns, they shared memories, they mourned not just Milvina, but all the survivors, all the dead, the entire tragedy that had shaped a century of storytelling. And now, 15 years after Milvina's death, where are we? The Titanic is more famous than ever. There have been multiple films, countless documentaries, thousands of books. The wreck is deteriorating on the ocean floor, eaten by bacteria, slowly dissolving into rust and memory. In a few decades, it will be gone entirely, reduced to a stain on the seafloor. The physical ship will vanish, and all that will remain are the stories. Those stories have been told and retold so many times that they've taken on the quality of myth. We know them by heart. We've seen them dramatized, analyzed, debated. We know about the iceberg, the lifeboats, the band, the women and children first, the rich who survived and the poor who didn't. We know it all. But do we really know it? Do we understand what it was like for Eva Hart to watch her father disappear into a crowd and never come home? Do we understand what it was like for Frederick Fleet to spend 50 years wondering if binoculars would have made a difference? Do we understand what it was like for J. Bruce Ismay to be called a coward for the rest of his life? Do we understand what it was like for any of them? Probably not. We can't. We weren't there. We don't have the nightmares. We don't carry the guilt. All we have are the stories they left behind, imperfect and incomplete, filtered through trauma and time and the distortions of memory.
The end of memory and what remains. So here we are, drifting toward the end of this long, sad story. Let's talk about what we owe these people, these survivors who lived through something unspeakable and then had to live with it for the rest of their lives. First, we owe them accuracy. We owe them the truth of their stories, not sanitized versions or dramatic exaggerations. We owe them the complexity of their experiences, the fact that some survivors thrived and others were destroyed, that survival was random and unfair, that there were no easy lessons or neat morals. The Titanic wasn't a story about good guys and bad guys. It was a story about a ship that sank and the people who had to live with the consequences. Second, we owe them respect for their privacy. Many survivors didn't want to talk about the Titanic. They wanted to move on, to be something other than survivors. We should honor that. We should stop treating trauma as content, as something to be mined for entertainment value. Every time we make another Titanic movie, every time we turn the disaster into a backdrop for a romance or an adventure, we're using other people's pain as a storytelling device. Maybe that's inevitable. Humans have always told stories about tragedies, but we should at least acknowledge what we're doing. Third, we owe them remembrance of the dead. The survivors wanted us to remember the 1,500 people who didn't make it, not as statistics, but as individuals, as fathers and mothers and children, as people with plans and dreams and futures that ended in cold water in the middle of the Atlantic. The survivors carried those memories for as long as they could, and now that they're all gone, the responsibility falls to us. Fourth, we owe them the lesson they tried to teach us, that safety matters more than profit, that regulations exist for a reason, that arrogance and overconfidence kill people. The Titanic sank because there weren't enough lifeboats, because ice warnings were ignored, because everyone believed the ship was unsinkable. Those same patterns of thinking, profit over safety, confidence over caution, still exist today. The survivors wanted their nightmare to mean something, to prevent future disasters. We owe them the effort to learn from their experience. But honestly, I don't know if we've learned anything. We keep building bigger, faster, more impressive things while cutting corners on safety. We keep prioritizing shareholder value over human life. We keep trusting that technology will save us, that we've conquered nature, that disaster can't happen to us. And then it does, and we're shocked, and we promise to do better, and then we forget. The survivors couldn't forget. That was their burden. Frederick Fleet saw that iceberg every time he closed his eyes. Eva Hart heard the screams every night in her dreams. J. Bruce Ismay relived those moments in the lifeboat over and over, wondering if he could have done something different, if he should have stayed on the ship, if his survival was a sin he could never atone for. They carried that weight so we wouldn't have to. They remembered so the dead wouldn't be forgotten. They told their stories over and over, even when it hurt, even when they wanted to forget, because they understood that memory is a kind of Dewey, a kind of memorial. And now they're all gone. There's no one left who was there. The last voice has gone silent. The Titanic has passed completely into history, into the realm of things that happened to people who are all now dead. What remains? Stories remain. Photographs remain. Artifacts remain. Those recovered from the wreck, those saved by survivors, those preserved in museums around the world. Descendants remain, carrying forward family histories, keeping memories alive. The wreck itself remains for now, though it's deteriorating rapidly and will eventually disappear. But the survivors themselves, the actual people who lived through that night, they're gone. All of them. Every single one. The last link to living memory snapped in 2009, and now there's only history. There's something achingly final about that. As long as there were survivors, the Titanic was still partly in the present tense. It was something that happened to people who were still alive, still among us, still able to say, I was there. Now it's fully in the past tense. It's something that happened to people who are dead. The survivors would probably be relieved. They could never escape the Titanic while they were alive. Every interview, every anniversary, every film, every book dragged them back to that night. Death was probably the only escape they ever got. But we remain, and we're still telling the story, still making films and documentaries, still writing books and articles, still fascinated by this disaster that happened over a century ago. Why? What is it about the Titanic that captivates us? Maybe it's the scale of it, the biggest ship in the world, unsinkable, destroyed on its maiden voyage. Maybe it's the human drama, the heroism and cowardice, the sacrifices and selfishness, all played out in a few terrible hours. Maybe it's the class dimensions, the fact that money could buy you a better chance of survival, that steerage passengers were literally locked below deck, while first-class passengers escaped. Maybe it's the romance, the doomed love stories, real and imagined, that took place on board. Maybe it's just the simple tragedy of 1,500 people dying unnecessarily because of hubris and inadequate safety measures. Or maybe we keep telling the story because we need to believe that tragedy means something, that suffering can be redeemed through remembrance, that the dead can be honored by not being forgotten. We need to believe that these people didn't die for nothing, that their deaths changed something, mattered somehow. The survivors would probably tell us that tragedy doesn't mean anything. It just is. Bad things happen. People die. Those who survive carry the weight. There's no redemption arc, no silver lining, no greater purpose. There's just what happened, and then everything that came after. But they told their stories anyway. They talked to reporters, wrote memoirs, gave interviews, attended commemorations. They kept the memory alive, even though it hurt, even though they wanted to forget. Because maybe, on some level, they understood that forgetting would be worse. Forgetting would mean the dead died twice, once in the water and once in memory. So we remember. We tell the story. We honor the survivors by telling their truth. Not the mythologized, romanticized versions, but the real stories of real people who lived through something terrible and then had to figure out how to keep living. Margaret Brown, who survived and became famous and carried on being loud and larger than life until the end. J. Bruce Ismay, who survived and was destroyed by shame and spent the rest of his life wishing he'd died. Eva Hart, who survived as a child and carried the trauma for 91 years, always hearing the screams, always seeing her father disappear. Frederick Fleet, who spotted the iceberg and spent his life wondering if he could have done more, and died by his own hand 53 years later. The Navratil boys, orphaned and traumatized, growing up in the shadow of a father who'd loved them enough to kidnap them and then died saving them. Violet Jessup, the unsinkable stewardess, who survived 3 maritime disasters and kept going back to sea because what else could she do? Charles Lightoller, who went from the Titanic to World War I to Dunkirk, always serving, always dutiful, always trying to make up for the night he sent away half-empty lifeboats. Lawrence Beasley, who wrote his book and then spent the rest of his life obsessed with the disaster, trying to sneak onto film sets, unable to let go. All of them. Every single survivor. Every person who climbed into a lifeboat or clung to wreckage or somehow, miraculously, made it through that freezing night. They all had to figure out how to live afterward. Some succeeded, some failed, most fell somewhere in between. Their stories are over now. The last survivor died 15 years ago. The living memory is gone. All that remains is history. Stories and artifacts and photographs and the slowly dissolving wreck on the ocean floor. But maybe that's enough. Maybe the stories are what matter. Maybe, as long as we keep telling them, keep remembering, keep honoring the complexity and tragedy and humanity of what happened, the survivors haven't truly disappeared. They live on in the telling, in the remembrance, in the long, slow, mournful story of the Titanic and everyone who survived it. So here, at the end, let's say their names one more time. Not all of them, there were over 700 survivors and we couldn't possibly name them all, but some of them. The ones whose stories we've followed through this long, sad night. Margaret Brown, J. Bruce Ismay, Archibald Gracie, Lucy Dyer Edwards, Dorothy Gibson, Charles Juffin, Wallace Hartley, wait, no, he died. But the survivors remembered him, so he belongs here too. Lawrence Beasley, Charlotte Collier, Carl Baer and Helen Newsom, Edith Russell and her lucky pig, Dickinson and Helen Bishop, Eva Hart, the Navratil boys, Michelle and Edmund, Lucille and Cosmo Buff Gordon, Violet Jessup, Harold Bride, Masabumi Hosono, Madeline Astor, Charlotte Cardeza, Charles Lightoller, Frederick Fleet, Edith Brown, Jack Thayer, Lillian Asplund, Barbara West, Ruth Becker, Eleanor Schumann, Milvina Dean. And all the others whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't recorded, who survived and then lived quiet lives and died without ever becoming famous or writing memoirs or giving interviews. They were there too.
They mattered too. They survived too. This is their story. This is what happened after the Titanic sank. This is how they lived with what they'd seen. This is how they carried the weight of survival, the guilt of living when others died, the knowledge that they'd been part of one of history's greatest disasters. Some thrived, some broke. Most just carried on, day by day, year by year, decade by decade, until finally death came and released them from the burden of memory. And now we're the ones who remember. We're the ones who tell the story. We're the ones who carry it forward, imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently. That's what we owe them. That's what remains. Just the story, told over and over, a long meditation on survival and guilt and memory and what it means to live through something terrible. So there it is. 2 hours of talking about people who survived the Titanic and then had to figure out how to live with it. Some of their stories are uplifting, most are sad, a few are just strange. All of them are human. That's the end. That's where the story stops. With memory and silence and the slow dissolution of the past into history. Rest well. Rest easy. Let the stories settle. Let the survivors rest. They've earned it. Good night.